I'm Johanna, and I'm here to talk about books. But this video is going to be a little bit different from what I've previously covered here at Johanna's library, because there is so much going on. And I'm glad I distanced myself from the news because it feels like things just keep getting worse. And I know it often feels that way because news companies push out the stories that get the most attention, and what gets the most attention tends to be bad news. But I don't think anyone can deny that there's a lot of going on. And it goes without saying that one of the most shocking and disturbing things happening right now is the war on Palestine. I'm not making this video from the perspective of an expert intent on educating others. Quite the opposite. There are people doing that, and more power to them. Their efforts are much needed. I wanted to make this video to educate myself in the best way that I know how. Through books. In this vlog, I'm going to be reading 5 books by Palestinian writers about Palestine. And I hope you will all join me for this illuminating literary journey. It was very difficult because there were so many books that sounded great. I honestly think this will need to be a 2-parter because there were at least 5 other books that I could just as well have chosen. As usual, I've tried to pick a variety of different stories from different perspectives set in various time periods, ranging from a nonfiction account to help me better understand the conflict's history to what seems to be a more lighthearted perspective to help humanize the people of Palestine. I think that when a country has been so ravaged by war, that becomes their entire identity in the rest of the world. And it must be so exhausting to have your entire existence pinholed into a conflict that was forced upon you. So while I want to educate myself on the issue, I think it's really important to give Palestinians a place to exist beyond that issue. Without further ado, let's get into the books that I'll be reading. First up, we have the most intentionally educational book on this list, The 100 Years' War on Palestine by Rashid Khalidi. I think this will be just what I need to set the historic scene. This summary in The Guardian clearly sums up what appealed to me about this book. Not everyone will agree with Rashid Khalidi's settler colonialist analysis of the Israeli-Palestinian issue, but he powerfully lays out the current asymmetry of the conflict, decades of bad faith negotiations by Britain, the US, and Israel, and the many failings of the Palestinian leadership that have led to the dark present moment. There are precious few English-language histories of Palestine, and this is the latest, drawing on Khalidi's family archives and experiences as an activist and peace negotiator. I'm going to listen to this as an audiobook, which tends to be my favorite way to consume nonfiction, so this historical account is going to be a thread through these other stories that I'll be reading on paper. The next book on the list feels like a very suitable follow-up to the historic overview because it is set right after World War II. It's called Mother of Strangers by Sawad Amiri, and it actually just arrived in the mail today, along with one of the other books that I'll be reading for this video. The description says, "It brings Jaffa vividly to life as a beautiful city by the sea where Jews, Palestinians, and Christians lived peacefully just before it was destroyed by the 1947 UN General Assembly resolution that would partition Palestine into 2 states and the end of the British Mandate on May 14, 1948. So it seems to juxtapose this idyllic sounding place with the demolition and displacement of families that followed the bombing. And I think at the same time it's a love story. I expect this to be very beautiful and heartbreaking, offering an insight into this moment in time through the lens of fiction, both informative and poetic at the same time. We'll see. Next on the list is a book called Against the Loveless World by Susan Abelhawa. This one really intrigued me after the first few lines. Let me pull them up. It starts, "I live in the cube. I write on its glossy gray cinder block walls however I can, with my nails before, with pencils now that the guards bring me some supplies." So I was instantly drawn in. According to Storygraph, this is a stimulating and emotionally charged novel that is a perfect fit for readers who appreciate powerful stories of female resilience, feminist struggles, and the unyielding quest for freedom and self-discovery. So, it's a perfect fit for me. I found this book on my library app, which I usually only use for audiobooks, but there it was. So, for the very first time, I'm going to be reading a book on my phone. Like I said earlier, I think it's really important to give people who have been heavily impacted by war in their countries a place to exist beyond that specific issue. Just because that might be all that some of us hear about doesn't mean that that should be the only thing we focus on. So when I came across this next book, it sounded like such a perfect fit for what I was looking for that I instantly pre-ordered it. And it is Behind You is the Sea by Susan Moadi Daraj. It just sounds so lovely. Here's the description. Funny and touching, Behind You is the Sea brings us into the homes and lives of three main families, Palestinian immigrants who've all found a different welcome in America. So it mentions that the book tackles stereotypes about Palestinian culture, to weave a complex social fabric replete with weddings, funerals, broken hearts, and devastating secrets. So I really like that it weaves a Palestinian perspective into an American immigrant story. I expect it to be really heartwarming. Last but certainly not least is a poetry book. It's called Rifqa, and I hope I'm pronouncing that right. I couldn't track down a pronunciation guide online. But yes, Rifqa by Mohammed El-Kurd. I don't read very much poetry at all, even though I used to write poems a lot when I was younger. But similar to the nonfiction book, I thought it would be nice to include a book of poems that I can pick up throughout my reading journey. This one seems to be very focused on the author's personal experience of displacement and dispossession in Palestine. So it sounds like it could be a heavy one, but I think it will be really illuminating, and I'm happy to include it as part of this selection. So, lots of literature at my fingertips that sounds to me compelling and enlightening. I will come back with an update at some point. In the meantime, I hope you're all staying safe. I hope that you're taking care of yourselves, and I hope more than anything that by the time I post this, it will be in a much happier circumstance. Anyway, I'm off to escape into the world of books. It's a very dreary day today, which is kind of how I feel inside. Not because of the amazing book that I just finished, but just because there's a lot of going on. Yeah, it just keeps going, you know? And you're just constantly bombarded with horrible headlines about so many different things. And meanwhile, I scroll through TikTok, and every single video I see is people doing their very best to raise money for people in Palestine. But anyway, in the face of all this, there are always books. And I'm pleased to report that Against the Loveless World by Susan Abulawa was fantastic. This was such a wonderful book, a book about resistance, about feminism, about self-discovery, and such a gorgeous love story as well. We meet Nar in the Cube, which is a prison cell she's been living in for who knows how long. She mentions being visited by a few reporters and a few names from her past. She tells us her whole story from this place of isolation. Throughout the book, we switch between her perspective from the Cube and memories of her past, and in this way, her extraordinary story unfolds. Nar is a woman who has been shunted from place to place, never really belonging anywhere. Her parents are Palestinian refugees who never saw Kuwait, where they ended up, as home, while Kuwait is the only home that Nar has really ever known, while Palestine is a distant place that she doesn't have much of a connection to. But Nar goes through some very difficult things in Kuwait that will stay with her forever. She has a very short-lived relationship that leaves her confused and the source of gossip in her town. She lives with conflicting feelings of pride for being able to support her family and help send her brother to university, and shame for lying about how she makes her money. She grows up very quickly. Eventually, her family have to leave again following Iraq's invasion of Kuwait, and they end up in Jordan. But Jordan is not really a home to Nar. In fact, she doesn't really feel welcome anywhere. Palestinians endure discrimination no matter where they go. And in fact, they're even treated as tourists, and much worse, in their own country. That is a really big takeaway for me. After reading this book, I feel like I've gained such a great insight into the Palestinian experience. The horrors of the Israeli occupation and the way that they treat indigenous people is unspeakable, yet Abulawa is able to capture it in such a frank yet poetic way. Without her straightforward writing style, I think this would have been an extremely difficult read. But she frames, at times, harrowing events through the lens of this woman looking back on her life from the solitude of her prison cell, and this distance she creates makes the events a lot easier to endure as a reader, I think. And this book just made me love women so much more than I already do. There are so many gorgeous bonds between women and acts of defiance and feminist messages. Women's connections formed in beauty salons and in the comfort of traditionally women-led tasks like cooking or washing dishes, and in united fronts against misogyny. Nar is such a brave and powerful person, and I love her. I feel like my thoughts are all over the place, but another thing I learned is that the title, Against the Loveless World, comes from James Baldwin's The Fire Next Time. The full quote is, "For here you were, big James named for me. You were a big baby, I was not. Here you were, to be loved, baby, hard at once and forever, to strengthen you against the loveless world." I really like Baldwin. I've read quite a few of his essays, and Go Tell It on the Mountain, and I listened to If Beale Street Could Talk, which is an excellent audiobook. But I haven't read The Fire Next Time, so based on the way Nar talked about it, it was an instant add to my to-read list. I was just completely absorbed by Abulawa's writing and her characters. When I finished the last line of the book, I literally cried out because I was so moved, and I didn't expect the book to be over. That's the problem with the digital book, people. And then I literally just went on to read all the acknowledgements because they were written in the same beautiful prose as the rest of the book. She's written a few other books, one of which I very much considered reading for this video, called Mornings in Janine. So if I end up doing a part 2, you best believe that's going to be on it. Or I'm just going to read it at some point because I know it's going to be amazing. And if I hadn't already fallen in love with her enough, I just found out that she is a vegan animal rights advocate, just like me. So she's just out here Writing gorgeous novels, raising awareness about important issues, and helping animals. New favorite author? We must move on, however, and I am really looking forward to my next book, which is around here somewhere. I am very much looking forward to reading Mother of Strangers by Suad Amiri, and I'm also still carrying on with the 100 Years War on Palestine, which I'm working my way through slowly. I think it's been the perfect companion to the fiction I'm reading, and I already feel like I can engage in this conversation a lot more than I could before. I already feel like this has been such a good experience, and I'm really looking forward to continuing. So, off we go. I thought I was going to check in after finishing each book, but here's the thing. I just kept reading and reading, and before I knew it, I had finished Mother of Strangers, Rifqa, and the 100 Years War on Palestine. So let's talk about them. Starting with the 100 Years War on Palestine, this was great. It did exactly what I wanted it to do, which was to educate me about the events that led up to the horrors that we're seeing today. And it did this in a clear, well-researched, and comprehensive way. As the title indicates, this book takes us all the way back to 1917, when the British government's Balfour Declaration proclaimed that a national home for the Jewish people would be established in Palestine. The phrase commonly used in support of Zionism was "a land without a people for a people without a land," ignoring the majority Palestinian population that was already there. It then goes through the following decades of negotiations and decisions and conflicts in the region, indicating how at every turn Palestinians were neglected at best and dispossessed and killed at worst. I have to admit, some of the politics did go over my head, but that is not Khalidi's fault. I think he writes in a very accessible way, and he does a great job of incorporating his personal experiences into the historic accounts. It's detailed and informed, and as my understanding grew, so did my anger and hurt for the Palestinian people. In all, this book was a perfect backdrop for the fiction and poetry that I was reading, and I definitely recommend it to people who want to learn more about the war on Palestine. One of the books that the 100 Years War provided a helpful backdrop for was Mother of Strangers by Suad Amiri. This book broke my heart, as expected. It follows Subi, a well-respected young mechanic living in Jaffa in 1947, and pretty much the first half of the book sets out to show what a vibrant and bustling city Jaffa was. In fact, I made a note that the only sign that anything bad is going to happen comes on page 46. The city is full of people and languages from all over the world, lively cafes serving different cuisines, orange groves, colorful markets and festivals, a busy port. Mother of Strangers is the city's nickname, given for the friendliness of the people who live there. At the start of the book, Subi helps a wealthy client with a problem in his well, and he's rewarded with a beautiful English-made suit. And this suit becomes a symbol for all his hopes and dreams. He is obsessed with the prospect of wearing it when asking to marry his young love, Shams. But it's 1947, and that was the year that the British government, which had assumed responsibility for the Palestinian problem under a League of Nations mandate following the Balfour Declaration, left the Jews and the Palestinians to fight it out among themselves. This was the Nakba, which means catastrophe in Arabic. And this was obviously when things started to really escalate. It happens about halfway through the book. The once vibrant home to so many transforms into a rubbled, bombed city of refugees and looters. The things that Subi, Shams, their families, and so many others have to endure, from being displaced from their homes to being separated for years on end, are horrifying. And I think this book does a great job of shedding light on those horrors. It's rooted in historical events which are clearly placed in time with dates at the start of chapters and throughout the story. I didn't realize until the end of the book that even the characters are based on real people. In an epilogue, Amiri writes about meeting Subi and Shams, the real Subi and Shams, and interviewing them about their experiences. She shares where the various other characters ended up, often in refugee camps or on searches for their missing family members. And learning that, I will say that I think this might have worked even better as a nonfiction story about those characters. She writes so beautifully that sections like the epilogue stood out to me a little bit more than the novel itself, the writing in the novel itself, which at times felt a bit surface level. I wanted to know a bit more about the characters' personalities, especially Shams, and I was left a little bit confused about the novel's POV. So, based on the author's note, I personally feel like nonfiction might be a little bit better suited to her style. That being said, I'm sure Amiri has a good reason for fictionalizing this account. With so many stories of displaced Palestinian people, it probably would have been hard to get readers to care about Subi specifically. And if she hadn't made it into a novel, I might not have picked it up. I did really like it though, and I feel like I took a lot away from it in terms of my understanding of the Palestinian experience. Of the two novels I read though, if I had to pick one, I think I would recommend Against the Loveless World. They have quite a few parallels and themes, but I feel like Against the Loveless World went a little bit deeper. Before I talk about the last book, I want to briefly touch on the final novel that I set out to read, Behind You is the Sea. As I mentioned, I pre-ordered this book because I was so excited to read it, although I'm not really clear about the details because it says it was published in January 2024, so I don't know if it was just this specific edition, but all the editions that I came across were not available to order. In any case, it has yet to arrive. So because I have finished all the other books on my list, and because the prospect of doing a part 2 is very appealing given how much I've enjoyed this one so far, I'm going to save Behind You is the Sea for a potential part 2. It might be another vlog, or maybe it will be a review of that book specifically. Whatever it is, I can't wait for this book to finally arrive so that I can read it. I think I said before, I don't read poetry very much, so I'm by no means an expert, but I really enjoyed this book. I think Mohammed El-Kurd has a very distinct voice that blends striking language with equally striking images of war. The scenes and stories that he chooses to focus on are vivid and, unsurprisingly, awful. I like the variety in form. I often wondered why he chose to single out this specific word or to place this stanza separately, or what role the bits of Arabic text played. I don't know if I came to any good conclusions, but that's what poetry is about, right? Letting the poem sit with you and spend time in your mind. The author also writes from a really interesting perspective, I think, because he seems to be quite an established, outspoken advocate. Not only that, but he seems to come from a line of poets that use their writing to advocate for their rights. In the afterword, he shares that this poetry collection seeks to honor his grandmother, Rifqa. She had apparently endured many wars, lived longer than the Zionist colonization, and been hailed an icon of the Palestinian resistance by Jerusalemites before her death at 103 years old in 2020. So I think he writes from the compelling perspective of someone who has been inspired by activists who have paved the way before him. I thought a nice way to end this video would be to read one of his poems aloud to you. But before I do that, some closing remarks. I did not expect when I set out to make this video that it would be as eye-opening and as illuminating as it has been. I had the goal to educate myself about the conflict. Reading these stories has just opened my eyes in such a great way. And I'm so grateful that, you know, starting my little booktube channel has resulted in what I see as such a positive thing, because without it, I might not have buckled down to read 4 books by Palestinian writers in a row. But it's been such a positive experience. So, free Palestine. Free Palestine. I hope that what you take from this video is some excellent book recommendations for people who maybe want to learn more about the conflict as well. But also I hope that after this you will go interact and engage with the content that other creators are putting out to raise funds for people who need them and to raise awareness about the issue. So, we'll end with a poem. Thank you so much for watching. I hope that you enjoyed this video, and I hope to see you again soon. Bye. This poem is called "And They Leave and Never Leave," after Audre Lorde's movement song. I have studied the tight curls on the back of your neck moving away from me, and I have waited in stance, wilted for distance, rooted in the cracks of my ceramic bathroom tiles, staring into the mirror, waiting for your face to exit me. I have memorized the patterns of breaths in which your voice invaded my throat, gloated that you are leaving me. Atlanta put me in a taxi. Transit became home. This time in Palestine, there were no pomegranates in trees, but suitcases situated by storm, and I have fled a different kind of heartache than that my mother had pickled and jarred and served for me.